London, 1968. Led Zeppelin was just forming. Jimmy Page had left the Yardbirds behind and was building what would become one of the most powerful sounds in rock history. He was already legendary as a session musician, already respected for his Yardbirds work, already known as one of Britain's top guitarists. But there was one guitarist everyone talked about, one name that came up in every conversation, one player who'd changed everything when he arrived in London 2 years earlier: Jimi Hendrix. Page had seen him perform, had heard the records, had witnessed the devastation Jimmy left in his wake when he played. And Page had noticed something. Jimmy used a lot of equipment. Marshall stacks, massive towers of amplifiers turned up to maximum volume. And Jimmy Page had a theory. The story goes that Page and Hendrix crossed paths in a London club in 1968. Not a performance, just two guitarists in the same place, talking shop the way musicians do. Jimmy had just come from a gig, his roadies were loading out, and Page could see the equipment. 4 Marshall stacks, 4 massive towers of 100-watt amplifiers. Each stack was 2 cabinets high, 8 speaker cabinets total, each loaded with 4 12-inch speakers, 32 speakers, more than 300 watts of power, the wall of sound that had become Jimmy's signature. Page, who was known for his technical precision and his studio work, looked at all that gear and couldn't help himself. He'd been a session musician for years, working in studios where equipment was carefully chosen, where every element of the signal chain was considered, where tone was crafted with surgical precision. And here was Jimmy using brute force amplification to achieve his sound. Or was he? That was Page's question. "You need all that power to sound good?" Page said, not maliciously, but genuinely curious. He'd seen plenty of guitarists hide behind volume, using sheer loudness to mask weak playing. Was Jimmy one of them? What happens if you don't have the wall of sound? Jimmy looked at him, that slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the smile that usually meant something interesting was about to happen. He'd heard this before, people assuming his tone came from the equipment, not from him. "What are you saying?" Jimmy asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying," Page continued, warming to his argument, "that real tone comes from the fingers, not the equipment. I've worked sessions with great players, B.B. King, that lot, and they could plug into anything and sound like themselves. Any guitarist worth his salt should be able to make any amp sound good, even a small one." There it was, the challenge. Not aggressive, but clear. Prove that your sound isn't just about having the biggest, loudest setup in the room. Prove it's actually you making that magic, not Jim Marshall's amplifiers doing the heavy lifting. "You want me to play through a small amp?" Jimmy asked, already unplugging his guitar from his rig. "I want to see if that tone is you," Page said, "or if it's the Marshalls doing the work." Someone in the room whispered, "This is going to be good." They had no idea how right they were. Word spread quickly through the club. Jimi Hendrix was going to play through a small amp, not his Marshall stacks, not his usual setup, a small practice amp, something you'd use in a bedroom, not on stage. Someone found a Fender Princeton, a 15-watt amp, the kind of thing a beginner might use. Compared to Jimmy's usual 300+ watts of Marshall power, it was nothing, a toy. Page watched as Jimmy took his Stratocaster, unplugged from his usual rig, and plugged a single cable into this tiny amplifier. No effects, no pedals, no wall of sound, just guitar, cable, small amp. The room went quiet. This was the moment. Would Jimi Hendrix, guitar god, master of volume and feedback, the man who'd revolutionized electric guitar, would he sound like just another player without his equipment? Jimmy adjusted the volume knob on the Princeton, turned it to about 5, not even maximum. The amp could barely fill the room. You'd need complete silence just to hear it properly. Then he started playing. The first note stopped everyone. It was still that sound, that Jimi Hendrix sound, the tone that was unmistakable, warm, singing,
full of emotion and power despite coming from an amplifier the size of a shoebox. But it wasn't just that it sounded like Jimi, it was how good it sounded through such limited equipment. The Princeton was rated at 15 watts, barely enough to compete with a drummer in a small room. Jimi's usual rig was 20 times that power. And yet, through this tiny amp, the tone was perfect, pure, focused. He played Red House, a slow blues that didn't rely on volume or effects, just pure expression. The song he'd recorded for Are You Experienced, the one that showcased his blues roots. And somehow, through this tiny amp, Jimi made the guitar sing, cry, whisper, and scream. The bent notes, signature Jimi bends that could make grown men weep, came through perfectly. The sustain was there, even without the massive power of the Marshall stacks.
The way he hit harmonics, making the guitar ring like bells, worked flawlessly. The dynamics, from whisper-soft passages to powerful attacks, all translated through the little Fender. How was this possible? The amp had maybe 5% of the power Jimi usually used. There was no effects chain, no fuzz, no wah, no octave divider, no studio magic, no reverb, no room acoustics helping, just his fingers on the strings and that impossible tone pouring out of a practice amp that shouldn't have been capable of producing it. The room was dead silent except for the guitar. Everyone had stopped talking, stopped drinking, stopped moving. They were witnessing something rare, a master stripped of all advantages, proving mastery needs no advantages. Page stood there, his theory crumbling in real time. He'd thought, hoped maybe, that Jimi's sound was at least partly about the equipment, that with enough Marshall stacks, anyone could sound powerful, that the wall of sound was doing some of the work, carrying players who weren't quite as good as they seemed. But watching Jimi coax that tone from a Princeton, an amp that retailed for maybe $100, an amp that beginners used in their bedrooms, an amp that shouldn't be capable of expressing the complexity Jimi was pulling from it, Page realized it was the fingers, it was Jimi. The equipment just amplified what was already there. The magic wasn't in the Marshalls, the magic was in the man holding the guitar. What Page was witnessing wasn't magic, it was mastery. Jimi's touch on the strings was so controlled, so precise, that he could make any amp respond to him. The way he bent notes, not just pushing the string, but feeling exactly how much to bend to hit the emotion he wanted. The way he used the volume and tone knobs on the guitar itself, subtle adjustments that shaped the sound before it even hit the amp. The way he played with dynamics, soft touches that made the amp whisper, harder attacks that made it growl, all from the same small amplifier. This wasn't about power, it wasn't about having the biggest rig, it was about complete control over the instrument. Jimi could make a practice amp sound better than most guitarists could make a stadium system sound. And the bends, God, the bends. Jimi's note bending was so expressive that each bent note told a story. He wasn't just playing a blues scale, he was having a conversation, and the guitar was his voice. Through that tiny amp, every nuance came through, because Jimi's tone was in his hands. The other musicians in the room understood what they were seeing. This wasn't a parlor trick. This was a master, demonstrating that mastery transcends equipment. Someone whispered, "He's making a Princeton sound like a stack."
But that wasn't quite right. He wasn't making it sound loud. He was making it sound good. He was proving that volume and power weren't the point. The music was the point. And the music was coming from Jimi, not from the gear. Even on that small amp, you could hear everything that made Jimi special. The phrasing that drew from R&B, blues, rock, and something entirely new. The way he made the guitar sing melodically, even while playing rhythm. The control of feedback. Even on a tiny amp, he knew exactly how to coax musical sounds from what should have been unwanted noise. When Jimi finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Then applause, Not the screaming that usually greeted a Hendrix performance, but the respectful acknowledgement that comes when musicians witness something they know they'll never forget. Jimmy Page walked over to where Jimi was unplugging from the Princeton. "I was wrong," Page said simply. Jimi smiled. "About what?" "I thought the Marshalls were part of the secret," Page admitted. "I thought maybe the wall of sound was doing some of the work, but it's not. It's all you. You could play through anything and sound like that." "The Marshalls help," Jimi said, generous as always. "They let me do things I can't do with a small amp. The feedback, the power, the physical feeling of the sound. But yeah, the tone has to come from here." He held up his hands, calloused fingers, the tools that created the magic. "The amp just makes it louder," Jimi continued. "It doesn't make it better. If it doesn't sound good quiet, it won't sound good loud. It'll just be loud." What Jimi Page learned that night was something every guitarist eventually has to confront. Gear matters, but it's not what matters most. Yes, Jimi Hendrix used Marshall stacks. Yes, the wall of sound was part of his show, part of his sonic assault. But it wasn't the source of his greatness. It was the amplification of his greatness. The greatness itself came from years of playing, backing Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, playing the Chitlin circuit, countless hours of practice and performance that had made the guitar an extension of his body and soul. The Marshall stacks didn't create Jimi's tone, they just broadcast it to bigger audiences. Page, who would go on to create Led Zeppelin's massive sound, arguably even bigger and more powerful than what Jimi did, understood this viscerally. You could have all the equipment in the world, but if you didn't have the touch, the feel, the soul in your fingers, you had nothing.
The interesting thing is what Jimi Page did with this lesson. He didn't abandon big amplification. Led Zeppelin's sound would be massive, earth-shaking, the definition of heavy. But Page made sure it was built on a foundation of actual musicianship, not just volume. Listen to Since I've Been Loving You, or the Rain Song. Page playing with dynamics, with touch, with emotion. The power is there when needed, but it's in service to the music, not replacing it. Or listen to the acoustic sections of Stairway to Heaven. Page proving his worth on a quiet instrument, just as Jimi had proved his worth on a quiet amp. Page carried that lesson with him. Great playing sounds great at any volume. Bad playing is just loud. Years later, Page would say that Jimi Hendrix was the best guitarist he'd ever heard. This from a man who'd played with Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and every other British guitar god. This from a man who'd become a legend himself. But Page knew what he'd witnessed. He'd seen Jimi strip away all the equipment, all the volume, all the visual theatrics, and prove that the magic was in his hands the whole time. The Marshall stacks were Jimi's choice, not his crutch. He used them because they let him do things he wanted to do, create feedback symphonies, fill massive venues, physically move air with sound. But he didn't need them to be Jimi Hendrix. He could be Jimi Hendrix through any amplifier, through any guitar, probably through a fucking broom with strings stretched across it, because Jimi Hendrix was in his fingers. The story of Jimi and the Princeton became legendary among guitarists, though whether it happened exactly this way, or was embellished in the retelling, or was apocryphal entirely, nobody knows for sure. But the truth of it doesn't depend on whether this specific incident occurred, because every guitarist who ever saw Jimi play knew it was true. They'd seen him pick up different guitars and make them all sound like him. They'd heard him through different amps and recognized that tone immediately. They knew that Jimi's sound wasn't a product he purchased, it was something he created with every note. And that's the lesson that transcends this one story. Your tone is in your hands. You can buy the same guitar as your hero, you can buy the same amp, the same pedals, you can copy every piece of equipment in the chain, but you won't sound like them, because their sound comes from years of playing, from their unique touch, from the way their brain connects to their fingers.
Jimi proving he could sound like Jimi through a practice amp wasn't just showing off. It was revealing the fundamental truth about music. The equipment doesn't make the musician makes the music.
After that night, the story goes, Jimmy Page never questioned whether Jimi needed his Marshall stacks, because he'd seen that Jimi didn't need them, he chose them. And there's a difference. Needing equipment means you're dependent on it. Choosing equipment means you're using tools that serve your vision. Jimi chose Marshalls because they let him realize his sonic vision, the feedback, the power, the physical impact of the sound. But his vision existed independent of the equipment. The equipment just helped him share it with the world. Page took that understanding into Led Zeppelin. Yes, they'd be one of the loudest bands in rock history, but Page made sure the music worked at any volume because he'd learned from Jimi. If it doesn't work quiet, it doesn't work loud. Today, the tone is in the hands debate continues. Gear forums are full of arguments about whether equipment matters, whether you need vintage amps and guitars, whether modern digital modeling can recreate classic tones. And the answer Jimi demonstrated is yes, equipment matters, but it's not what matters most. The most expensive vintage Marshall stack won't make you sound like Jimi Hendrix, but practicing for thousands of hours, developing your touch, learning to hear the music in your head and translate it through your fingers, that might get you closer. The challenge Jimmy Page issued to Jimi, prove your tone isn't just the Marshalls, was answered definitively. The tone was Jimi. The Marshalls just made sure everyone could hear it. And that's the lesson every guitarist eventually learns, usually the hard way. You are your tone. Everything else is just amplification. If this story of how Jimi proved tone lives in the fingers moved you, subscribe for more untold tales of guitar mastery. Share this with someone who's obsessing over gear instead of practicing. Let us know in the comments what you think matters more, equipment or skill. And hit that notification bell for stories that remind us greatness can't be purchased, only earned through dedication and soul.